If you have a question, go into the chat box and type it. It'll go directly to Tobias while he's doing the presentation. And don't wait until the end for anything. As soon as you have the question, send it in, interrupt the presentation. It's the best flow. It will make sure that you get all of your questions answered, and it actually helps the webinars to be more valuable. But the first thing I do to lighten things up a little bit is I'm going to play a little bit of a video for you. Hi, I'm Tom Alston, and I'm going to give you some reasons why you should always pay sales or use tax on the purchase of an aircraft or a vessel. Let's get started. Number one reason, you're a politician and you'd get recalled if you were discovered to not be paying your fair share. Two, you're a private citizen and you believe politicians can do a better job spending the money than you can. Three, the tax is nothing but petty cash to you and you don't want to do the extra paperwork required to legally avoid the tax. Four, your corporation is doing well and you don't want to be attacked by politicians for being a corporate jet owner. Five, you're timid and can't face a tax auditor. That's my job. Let me do it. Six, your wife or girlfriend will nag you for taking a risk. I have a couple of questions for you. Where was she when you took the risk that created the company that created the wealth so you could buy the vessel or the aircraft? If she was complaining about risk then, you've already proved to her that risk is worth it. Seven, you got such a good deal on your aircraft or vessel, you feel like you should share something with the government. I never feel that way. Why do you? 8. Although the Supreme Court of the United States of America has affirmed your right to legally avoid tax, you still think it's illegal. 9. The last time you got audited, you met a great-looking woman that worked for the tax agency, and you want to see her again. Sure, all these are kind of in jest, but if you don't like any of them, you don't want to use any of these reasons, and you want to legally avoid the tax on an aircraft or a vessel purchase, call me first before you buy it. I'm Tom Alston, 916-691-9192, extension 108. The call's free. Thanks for listening. Well, we are back. I hope you enjoy my less than serious role about keeping things light. And Tobias, introduce yourself, put a little bit of your background and what your company does, and then it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us. I will start with a little bit of background on our company and then a little bit more about this presentation. TVPX has been around for, I think we're in our 17th or 18th year, depending on how you count. And forever we were known as the company that did 1031 exchanges. A lot changed this year, last year with the changes in the tax code. We're still doing quite a bit of 1031 exchanges in real estate, but the tax law changed things for 1031 in aviation. About 4 years ago, however, we started a trust company, and now we own quite a few aircraft all over the world in owner trusts for people. And we've expanded our services. And one of those services we've expanded into is customs brokerage. A lot of our aircraft that are in trust are bought and sold in cross-border transactions. And so in addition to holding title to the aircraft for our clients, we can help them import and export those aircraft. And those services can be bundled or they can be, utilized standalone. And we also have an aviation insurance brokerage as well to help our clients insure the aircraft that we have title to. Today we're going to be talking about importing aircraft into the United States. And I also have on the phone or on the presentation with us is our in-house customs compliance officer, Steve Pesch. Steve has been a customs broker for 35 years, and he will chime in from time to time as we go through here. So I want to start just by talking about bringing aircraft into the U.S. and making entry. When you import an aircraft, when the aircraft is the merchandise, you need to make entry through Customs and Border Protection. It's very different from when an aircraft comes into the U.S. with passengers and the people go through customs, but the aircraft is a vehicle. But when the aircraft has changed hands and the aircraft itself is cargo or merchandise, you need to make entry through customs. So that's the obvious one. And the bullet one here is if someone goes overseas, purchases an aircraft, flies back to the U.S., they need to land, and they need to make entry. And there's a process for doing so, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. Another example of when you need to make entry is when an aircraft comes into the U.S. for pre-buy. A lot of people think that, well, I don't have to make entry because there's no transaction. The buyer could still reject the aircraft. But it is merchandise that's moving as goods, and when it comes into the U.S. prior to the inspection, you need to make entry. And there's some question about who should be the importer of record in that case, because the transaction has not yet occurred, and so we can talk about that. So before the inspection takes place, you need to make entry. And I've heard some nightmares about people who bring their aircraft into the U.S. for a pre-buy. They go through the inspection process. The buyer agrees to close, asks for assurances that the aircraft is properly imported, and that's when someone says, oops, and so they have to figure something out, and they might fly the airplane out of the U.S., bring it back in, and import it, and it's very expensive to do that. Another area that's not well understood is when an aircraft's brought into the U.S. for repair. So there is no transaction contemplated, but it's coming into the U.S. to have some work done on it. There is a specific tariff number for goods returned to the United States for repair. In addition, when you look at the export regs, it talks about the requirements for exporting an aircraft that was imported for repair. And actually, when you export it after the repair, you don't report the value of the aircraft. You only report the value of the parts and the labor for that repair. Another example of when an aircraft has to be imported is when it comes into the U.S. for a trade show. So if there's a static display at NBAA, which many of us are familiar with, when the aircraft comes into the U.S., you need to make entry. And then when it leaves, unless it was sold at the trade show, when it leaves, you need to export it. And lease returns. A bank could have an aircraft on lease overseas for years, even if it's U.S. registered. When the lease ends and it comes back to the lessor, someone needs to make entry. And again, I say someone because there's some question of who can be the importer of record. And as I said, we'll talk about that. So those are 5 examples of when an aircraft needs to be imported and the importer has to make entry. So there's a number of different types of entries that you can do through customs. Informal entry, formal entry, TIB, warehouse, foreign trade zone entry, U.S. and foreign goods returned. Some of these apply to aircraft and some of them don't. The 4 that typically apply to aircraft are formal entry, TIB, U.S. goods returned, and foreign goods returned. The formal entry is what you're going to see 95% of the time. It's a full consumption entry for anything over 2,500, so that pretty much means all aircraft. And when you do a formal entry, you get the timely delivery of documents and data to Customs and Border Protection. There's going to be a customs bond, and there's going to be the payment of duties, taxes, and fees. Now with aircraft, there is no duties and taxes. There's only fees. There's a merchandise processing fee, and for aircraft, it caps out at $508.70. So that's going to be a formal entry. There's no restrictions after the fact. TIB is a temporary import. Stands for temporary importation bond, as noted here. And this is when you would bring something in duty-free. So you'd be able to avoid the $508.70 if you bring something in under TIB. But there are some strings attached. The first string is that the aircraft cannot be cannot be sold while it's in the U.S. The restriction is that can only be exported or destroyed. Well, you're not going to destroy a perfectly good aircraft, but what if you bring in a TIB for static display? The aircraft is here temporarily, but if a buyer comes along, now all of a sudden your hands are tied by the TIB. There may be a way around that, but by the letter of the law, it can only be exported or destroyed. So in the case of an aircraft, exported and then sold, which means you might have to export it and then bring it back into the U.S. for a pre-buy to sell to an interested buyer. So TIB, I question the logic of its use. I could see using it for repair potentially, where you know for certain that the aircraft is not going to be sold. But just to save $508.70, it might not be worth the trouble to tie your hands. U.S. goods returned entry under the Tariff Code 9801. This is also a duty-free entry, but there are also some restrictions. One of those is that if you bring an aircraft back to the U.S. that was manufactured in the U.S., that's why it's called U.S. goods, that you need to report any improvements and the value of those improvements that were made to the aircraft while it was abroad. Now, if the aircraft has changed hands a couple of times, it might be difficult to report that accurately. In addition, because of the value of the aircraft, there's a good chance after you import it, you're going to get an inquiry from Customs saying, prove that this is U.S. goods returned. Prove that it was manufactured in the U.S. And while we all know where, for example, a Cessna is manufactured, they still want to check the box, and you might have to go get a manufacturer's affidavit. And so that's time and effort in order to do that, and getting that document signed, and satisfying Customs. Was it really worth $508.70 to go through that process? Whereas you could have done a formal entry and just not have to worry about it. But it's there to be used if that's what someone chooses. Foreign goods returned is similar. Obviously, it's not U.S. goods. They'd be aircraft manufactured overseas, Dassault, Bombardier product, and so forth. And the rule there is that if you import it into the U.S., after it, at some point it was in the U.S. So let's just say it was, here 5 years ago. It's a Falcon 50EX. It was exported. Now it's changing hands. It's being imported back into the U.S. You need to be able to prove that the aircraft was exported within 3 years of the import and provide documentation to that effect. And again, if it's changed hands a couple times, it might be difficult to have access to those records to make that type of entry duty-free. There are 5 different parties in an aircraft import. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, of course. There's an importer of record. There's a customs broker, ultimate consignee, and the flight crew. I won't spend too much time on U.S. Customs and Border Protection. It's a division of Homeland Security. They enforce all the customs laws, and they collect the revenue through duties, taxes, and fees. The importer of record is interesting because it's not what you might think. The importer of record can be any party with a financial interest in a transaction. So it could be the seller, it could be the buyer, it could be the aircraft broker, it could be the customs broker, it could be a bank. So you could see a situation where you'd have a buyer and a seller negotiating over an aircraft being brought to the U.S. for a pre-buy. And the buyer says, well, I don't want to be the importer of record. I don't even know if I'm going to buy this aircraft. I could reject it. I don't want to be on the hook for 5 years of record keeping related to an aircraft that I may never own. Seller might say, well, I don't want to be the importer. We're not a U.S. company. We don't have a tax ID number. We don't know anything about bringing an aircraft into the United States. And so you have this impasse. Reality is that a foreign seller can be a U.S. importer. If they don't have a tax ID number, we can get them what's called a customs assigned number, which is a substitute for a tax ID number. And we can get them a continuous bond. So we can get over that impasse if the seller is willing to do that. The customs broker can also be the importer. They can use the customs broker's bond. So there's more than one way to skin a cat, I guess is what I'm trying to get to here. But somebody does need to make entry if the aircraft is coming into the U.S. to be sold. Customs broker is a third party licensed by U.S. Customs. The importer will give them a power of attorney to conduct customs business on their behalf. As I mentioned, they can act as the importer of record and use their own bond. And they communicate with customs, file all the entry documents. We file them through something called ACE, or the Automated Commercial Environment. And we collect and remit the duties, taxes, and fees that are owed to customs. As a technical matter, an importer of record does have the option to pay customs directly. The ultimate consignee. All entries have an ultimate consignee, and defined as the party in the U.S. who's essentially received the merchandise. So it can be the buyer. If the importer of record is the buyer, they can be their own ultimate consignee. But for a foreign importer, they would need someone in the U.S. to act in that capacity. And if the buyer doesn't want to do it or the aircraft broker doesn't want to do it, the customs broker can do it. So that's another role where you can sort of bridge the divide with the customs broker. The flight crew
Tobias,
plays a role.
This is Tom. Do you see the question that came through for you?
Yes, there was a question. Have you ever seen a case where a manufacturer executed a manufacturer's affidavit? I have not. You know, I don't know where you would go with that. I think you would probably start with the contracts department, maybe talk to legal. I'm not saying they won't, but I don't know of a case where they have. So I hope that answers the question. You know, I guess the point I was making earlier was it may be a lot more trouble to get that than to just do a formal entry and pay the 50870. Okay, the flight crew does play a role in the import to some extent. They will typically file the EAPIS manifest, and that's an electronic communication with customs. It basically says, this is when we're coming, this is the aircraft we're on, this is the registration, this is who's going to be on board. You want to notify customs if there's any changes to the schedule. The crew should have the DTOPS decal on the aircraft. And if there's no time to get the decal to the aircraft, because it's something you have to buy and order, it takes time to process, and they send it to you, and then you've got to send it to where the airplane is and put it on the bulkhead of the entry, then we at least want the crew to have a copy of the payment confirmation when they land. Crew must have U.S. passports and U.S. visas. And we like them to have a copy of the entry documents. If, again, like the DTOPS decal, if there's no time to get them a copy of the entry documents, we want them to have at least the entry number via email. And they should call U.S. Customs before they depart from wherever they're coming from and confirm the ETA and report any delays. The information that Customs requires on the entry documents, the Customs Form 3461 and the Customs Form 7501, things like the arrival date, the type of entry. So is it a consumption? Is it a TIB? Is it a 9801 entry? They want to know who the importer of record is and the ultimate consignee. The flight number we make up because there's no, you know, it's not like an American Airlines scheduled flight. There's a firm's code. Every port of entry has a firm's code associated with it. If there's no airway bill, we'll make up an airway bill on the piece count. The value of the merchandise. Very important to put the value of the aircraft on the entry. And this is something that people get a little funny about because They're very protective of the value of their aircraft. The one thing I tell them is, you know, this is all confidential. Customs doesn't disclose this to anyone. It's not going to end up in some public database. But it's also the area of importing merchandise where you probably have the most attempted fraud. If you can underreport the value of something, you can avoid paying taxes. And with an aircraft, it doesn't do you any good because it's capped out at 50870 regardless. So this is a non-starter, and usually people will come around and say, okay, we'll put down the contract number. But it's very important to be to make sure you report the value accurately. The harmonized tariff number. Everything in the world that's manufactured and imported into U.S. as goods has a tariff number associated with it. Aircraft fall under Chapter 88 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule. Fortunately, it's only a couple pages long. When you classify an aircraft, you start with the unladed weight in kilograms, so that's the weight of the aircraft with no crew, no fuel, no passengers, and then you've got to figure out the right code that it fits into. And it's a bit of a process of elimination, but then once you get to the right code section, you get your number and then you plug that into the entry. And also the country of manufacturer as well, they want on the entry. This is the classification number for an aircraft that's, of an unladen weight exceeding 15,000 kilograms. So this is going to be your large cabin class aircraft, used or rebuilt. If it was new, it wouldn't say 0090, it would say 00, I believe it's 10 or 20. But in any event, there's a code for military aircraft over 15,000 kilograms, cargo, military, and so you eliminate those and you sort of work your way down to 0090, which is used aircraft, used or rebuilt actually, and then other, because it's not military. Valuation we talked about. The one point I want to make here is that if you don't have a contract to sell the aircraft, then you've got to put something in there, and there are all sorts of references out there for what aircraft are worth. And I think if you put down a number that you have that's defendable, you shouldn't have a problem if Customs asks, how'd you come up with this value? You say, well, we went to VREF or whatever the reference is that you're using. In addition to the 7501 and the 3461, there are some additional things that the port of entry could ask for when an aircraft comes in. If there's no commercial invoice, we make up a pro forma invoice. The pro forma invoice has, who's the aircraft going from, who it's going to, the value of the aircraft, the description of the aircraft, the country of manufacturer, its weight in kilograms, and then it's got some notations on there, the tariff code and so forth. They also want the EAPIS manifest. They may want a bill of sale. They may want an airworthiness certificate. So what we do in advance of an import is we call the port. Even though we think we know the answer, we're looking for policy change to see if they're asking for additional information. Get the list of the things that they're looking for, and that's what we collect prior to the import. So we upload all of these, and then in some cases we fax them over with copies of the entry documents to Customs when we key everything in. Surety bonds. All imports, everything coming into the U.S. comes in under bond. The bond is really just an insurance policy so that Customs knows they're going to get their duties, taxes, or fees. Now with 50870 pretty much owed on any aircraft over 150,000, you can't buy a bond for $508.70. The minimum bond amount is $50,000. Now that's not the cost of the bond. The cost of the bond is only a couple $100. But basically the bond is there to make sure that they get paid. There's two types of bonds. One's a single entry bond and a continuous bond. You would think for a single entry of a single aircraft, you would use a single entry bond. But they're more expensive than continuous bonds, so why use them? We use continuous bonds. And they can be used continually, as the name implies, over the course of a year, and if you don't renew the bond, it'll lapse. A lot of broker-dealers that do importing for themselves and their clients, they'll have a continuous bond, and then they just renew it at the end of the year. Record keeping, very important. Importers, exporters, carriers all need to keep their records for 5 years. If you're audited by customs and you don't have good records of the import, it could result in fines and penalties. There are 3 levels of where fines and penalties can be implemented: simple negligence, gross negligence, and fraud. Simple negligence could be something like misclassification, fraud, underreporting value. What you can take away from the slide is that negligence, simple negligence, starts at 20% of the value of the merchandise. So for an aircraft that's millions of dollars, that can add up pretty quickly. Saying all that, you can work with customs. You can talk to them. If they think you're being honest, they'll help you. It's when you are subverting the rules or they think you're trying to get away with something. They have tremendous power, and if they want to make an example out of you by the letter of the law, this is where they can start. So it's not something to be taken lightly. Here's some examples of violations. Failure to make entries, so simply not making the entry. Record-keeping violations, as I mentioned. Valuation, obviously, undervaluing. Failure to pay the duty. If you don't pay the fee, they'll just liquidate the bond, and they'll take the $50,000. And then the surety will go after the importer, and then customs could still assess fines and penalties. And failure to use reasonable care and provide accurate information that could result in fines and penalties. Our process is pretty straightforward. We have a customer information sheet that we start with. We're gathering information about the importer, the import itself, the aircraft. There's nothing on our customer information sheet that has anything to do with any other type of merchandise. We are focused entirely on aviation. That allows us to draft our power of attorney and our terms and conditions. That's really our agreements between us and our importer client. We have one document that's a little unusual, the TVPX, which is our consent form. As I mentioned, we have a trust business, and that's a separate company. And the rules for the confidentiality of customs business and information are so strict that I want to make sure that if there was any cross-pollination between emails and communication, that we had the consent of the client up front to share information among the different companies and any named third parties in the consent form. So if there's an aviation attorney or someone like that that the client wants us to share our customs documents with, we can do so. It also helps us share the KYC and due diligence information if the trust company has already done that, so we don't have to repeat that process. We gather up all the other information and the documents that customs is looking for in the port of entry, and then we key in the entry. If there is no trust involved, we'll do the due diligence and background check here in Boston as opposed to our office in Salt Lake. We'll verify and see if the tax ID number for the importer is in the automated commercial environment. If not, we'll make sure we'll put them in the system. We'll look to see if they have a bond on file. There's no need to buy another bond if they already have a continuous bond that we can use. We'll purchase the DTAPs if required. If no one's done that, we'll just take that task on for the client. And then we communicate with customs before, during, and after the entry. Do you as a company help in regards to working with customs if I'm issued fines and penalties? I think in that case we would refer you to a customs attorney to help you through that process. That's not really the role that we would play. That's a question that just came up. Sorry to interrupt there. The import process on the day of arrival, we track the arrival of the aircraft, and we will call customs after about an hour, and we will get the electronic release. I've got one slide on exporting aircraft to make the point that it's just as important to properly export an aircraft and report the electronic export information. Similar to ACE, we do those filings in the automated export system. There's no bond required because there's no duties, taxes, and fees on exports. And there needs to be an exporter of record or U.S. principal property and interest. So the exporter has to have a permanent U.S. address or tax ID number. If they don't have that, then they need to hire an agent, and we can serve in that capacity. Exports are subject to the Export Administration Regulations, which is a huge volume of information. And what you can take away from this is you've got to be very careful with where the aircraft is going, which country, what individuals, who's going to have access, are there any freight forwarders or customs brokers on the other side. All of those folks need to be vetted to make sure that, you know, you're not sending an airplane to someone who's going to do something nefarious with the aircraft. We actually have them sign end-user statements that they're not going to be using the aircraft for biological or chemical or nuclear weapons, and that they're not going to resell and re-export the aircraft to someone who's going to do those things. So you have to be very careful, you know, in vetting the consignee and any other parties, making sure that no one's on the denied parties list, or perhaps that the aircraft or the export requires a license. And we actually have a questionnaire for an export process. It's different from our import questionnaire. And it's leading in the sense that if you answer the questions a certain way, we can identify if the transaction needs a license or not. And if it does need a license, that's going to slow the process down considerably, because you then need to get registered with the State Department, and it's another process entirely. And that's all I have. Any other questions? I only got those two.
I might make it. I'll have it. This is Tom. I have a question. Can you relay to us any stories or experiences without revealing the identities that might help you make some of the points to provide the necessity of why it's better for someone who's doing this to hire a company like yours as opposed to trying to do it on their own?
Well, you really can't do it on your own, because you have to have access to the automated commercial environment where the electronic filings are done. And just getting access to that is a process. I will tell you that, you know, we had an instance where an aircraft came in, someone didn't make entry, Customs stopped them, they were on their way somewhere else after they landed. They told the crew to go to a hotel and come back on Monday. This was on a Friday. The owner, you know, just spent a lot of money on an aircraft, did not want to wait till Monday. So we got a call late on a Friday, I think it was 5 or 6 o'clock, and they said, you know, what do we do? You know, we got very comfortable with who the client was. We did our vetting very quickly. Also, the strength of the referral source was helpful. We used our bond, and we were the importer. We were able to get all the information we needed, and did the keyed in the entry by, I don't know, 10 p.m. that night, and the crew was able to come back at 6 a.m. and leave. So, you know, that's a case where they just plain forgot to make the entry, and you know, would have been a long weekend had we not been able to, you know, get things done for them quickly. I do know of another instance where someone had their airplane seized, and they didn't get back for a week or two, and of course a tremendous inconvenience. I got another question here. Does this export list include those aircraft that are registered in the country of destination prior to departing the U.S.? That's a good question. I suppose you could have an aircraft that's in the U.S., you know, in the customs territory of the United States for a number of years. That's imported, and the registration doesn't change, and then it does need to be exported. I think that would be an unusual situation, but I suppose it's possible. If you can send Kelsey your contact information, I would be certainly willing to look into that further. But I suppose it's, you know, theoretically possible.
Hey, Tom.
There's another question that just came through.
Yeah.
Steve, you're trying to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna go back to your comment about the reason for using like a broker like TVPX and some experience like us is, number one, you know, we're going to make sure that the entry is classified correctly, the harmonized tariff number. Number two, we're going to make sure the right value is on the entry. Because right now, with U.S. Customs, the penalties on valuation are more than just an incorrect tariff number or, you know, certain wrong information. So, you know, a broker will make sure we ask the right questions. Is it the total price paid or payable? Are you sending any money back overseas to the shipper or to the manufacturer or seller? If you sell it for more than the plane's worth here in the U.S., we make sure, you know, if there's anything that happens in the aviation industry with tariff numbers or you know, embargoes or anything, we make sure we relay that to the customer. So we kind of keep them updated, whereas they may not hear certain things that we hear because we get these CSM messages from customs. We see about the tariff changes. We hear about country manufacturer, things that if a plane got made in China, there's additional duties. So there is value added to have an experienced broker. And we just kind of make sure that everything is done the right way. And also, if you get any requests for information from U.S. Customs, we help you, you know, answer those. For example, you know, the value of these planes sets off a little bit of an alarm with Customs and with the Census Department because they're monitoring the imports, the exports, the trade. And usually after I clear a plane, within about a month, I usually get an email from the Department of Census asking me to send them the entry packet. So besides Customs looking at the entry, Census Department is looking. They're looking at the value, country manufacturer, the harmonized tariff number to make sure everything looks right. So just value added. Broker's going to make sure that all that's taken care of, answered correctly. And if you get that 28, which is a request for information from Customs, it's going to ask you maybe for the manufacturer's affidavit that Tobias mentioned if you enter a good U.S. goods entry. They're going to ask if you're related to the shipper manufacturer. They're going to ask you for proof of payment. So before that's even answered, we go over that first to make sure we're all on the same page, we have the right information. So that's one of the benefits of using a broker. You had mentioned that before.
I've got two more questions here. Does the U.S. government shutdown affect anything with paperwork in regards to importing and exporting? We haven't had any trouble making entries with respect to the importing process and the exporting process. But we have heard of issues with aircraft unable to get fly wires, you know, related to some of our trust transactions. So there are other issues with respect to aviation that are being impacted, but specifically to you know, to importing and exporting and doing the filing, we have not had any issues. Another question here: where is your company located? We are in Concord, Massachusetts. Another question here is: which ports of entry do you find have the fastest and most accommodating customs personnel? It seems like Bangor, Maine, does the most entries, and I think that's just because that's the direction that a lot of aircraft, you know, come in over the North Atlantic, land in Bangor and cleared. So they do a lot of aircraft up there. Of the ports where we brought aircraft into, they don't ask for all of the different things: bills of sale, upload the crew visas, airworthiness certificate. They pretty much want the entry documents. the pro forma invoice, DTOPS, and the EAPIS. So they're very easy to work with there, and I think Bangor is a great place to bring in aircraft.
Anchorage, Alaska works. They just ask for a little bit more documentation than Bangor, Maine, but it's pretty easy to clear in Anchorage, Alaska as well.
Any other questions?
All right. Doesn't seem to be any more questions, and I want to thank both our presenters, the gentleman from TVPX who did such a great job. And I want to, this is a public service announcement to all of the people that are on the webinar. If you know of a subject or anyone that would be a good speaker for our webinar, please contact Kelsey in my office and let us know. We want to continue this free information service for aircraft and vessel owners. And we're just trying to become a good hub to get you good information from the best personnel and the best professionals in both industries. Tobias, thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much for being on. And I'm going to end this webinar now.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.